The village of St. Mary Mead had always prided itself on maintaining the gentle rhythms of English country life, where the most scandalous events typically involved disagreements over flower arrangements or the occasional dispute about the proper way to serve cream tea. It was therefore with considerable satisfaction that the residents prepared for the annual summer fete at the vicarage, an event that had become as predictable and comforting as the chiming of the church bells each Sunday morning. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the ancient elm tree in the vicarage garden, her knitting needles moving with practiced precision as she worked on a soft lavender shawl. To the casual observer, she appeared entirely absorbed in her handiwork, occasionally pausing to admire the delicate lace pattern emerging from her careful stitches. Those who knew her well, however, understood that Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes missed nothing of the social tableau unfolding around her, and that her seemingly innocent observations often contained more insight than the most thorough investigation. The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows across the immaculate lawn, where white tables had been arranged with military precision. The air hummed with the genteel chatter of St. Mary Mead's most respectable residents, punctuated by the delicate clink of teacups and the occasional burst of laughter from the younger guests gathered near the croquet lawn. Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a floral dress that rivaled her prize-winning roses, moved among the guests with the satisfied air of a hostess whose event was proceeding exactly according to plan. "Such a lovely turnout, don't you think, Miss Marple?" The vicar's wife, Griselda Clement, settled herself in the chair beside the elderly detective, her cheeks flushed with the exertion of organizing games for the village children. "Though I must confess I'm rather puzzled by our mysterious guest. Mrs. Hartwell arrived this morning with barely an introduction, claiming to be a distant cousin of the late Colonel Hartwell from Gossington Hall. She's taken rooms at the Blue Boar and seems to know quite a lot about village affairs for someone who's never been here before." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment as her gaze shifted to a woman standing near the refreshment table. Mrs. Venetia Hartwell appeared to be in her early 50s, with silver-streaked auburn hair arranged in an elegant chignon and clothes that spoke of London sophistication rather than country practicality. There was something about her bearing that suggested she was accustomed to being noticed, yet she seemed to be making a deliberate effort to blend into the background of village respectability. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, her voice carrying that mild, bird-like quality that encouraged confidences. One would think that distant cousins might have visited before now, particularly if the Colonel spoke of them. Did she mention how long she plans to stay? That's just it. She was rather vague about her plans. Said something about settling family affairs and needing time to think. But Colonel Hartwell died nearly 6 months ago, and the estate has been settled for weeks. Griselda lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I think there's something rather sad about her. She has that look of someone who's suffered a great disappointment." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, filing away this observation along with several others she had made during the afternoon. Mrs. Hartwell had indeed seemed to be watching the other guests with unusual intensity, particularly focusing on a small group gathered around the tea table where Dr. Haydock was regaling his listeners with amusing stories from his practice. Among that group was Mr. Geoffrey Pemberton, a newcomer to the village who had recently purchased the old Blackwood Cottage and was said to be writing a book about local history. What had caught Miss Marple's attention was the way Mrs. Hartwell's composed expression had faltered when she first caught sight of Mr. Pemberton. It was only for a moment, a brief widening of the eyes, a slight intake of breath, but it suggested recognition, and not necessarily of a pleasant nature. Mr. Pemberton, for his part, had shown no sign of having noticed Mrs. Hartwell at all, though Miss Marple had observed him carefully, positioning himself so that his back remained toward her throughout the afternoon. "I believe I shall have another cup of tea," Miss Marple announced, gathering her knitting. "Would you care to join me, my dear?" As they approached the refreshment table, the conversation among Dr. Haydock's group became audible. Mr. Pemberton was speaking in his cultured voice about his research into the village's past, mentioning his particular interest in the Victorian era and the fascinating stories he had uncovered in various family archives. "You'd be amazed at what people keep hidden in old trunks and forgotten drawers," he was saying with a charming smile. "Letters, photographs, documents that tell the most extraordinary stories. Sometimes I feel like an archaeologist piecing together lives from fragments." Mrs. Hartwell, who had been standing just close enough to overhear, suddenly stepped forward. "How fascinating, Mr. Pemberton. I wonder if you've come across any references to the Hartwell family in your research. I'm particularly interested in anything from the 1890s. The effect of her words was immediate and striking. Mr. Pemberton's teacup rattled against its saucer as he set it down rather too quickly, and his face went quite pale beneath his summer tan. For a moment, the two stared at each other with an intensity that seemed to exclude everyone else present. "I'm afraid I haven't encountered that name in my work," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Though, of course, my research has been rather focused on specific aspects of local history." "Of course," Mrs. Hartwell replied smoothly, though Miss Marple noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a cucumber sandwich. "How foolish of me to expect such a coincidence. After all, the past is full of secrets that are better left undisturbed, don't you think?" Before Mr. Pemberton could respond, the peaceful atmosphere of the garden party was shattered by a piercing scream from the direction of the vicarage. The sound came from inside the house, high and desperate, followed by the crash of something heavy falling. Conversations died mid-sentence as heads turned toward the source of the disturbance. "Good heavens," Dr. Haydock exclaimed, already moving toward the house. "That came from the study!" A small crowd followed him through the French doors that led from the garden into the vicarage's interior. Miss Marple, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her years, found herself among the first to reach the study door. The scene that greeted them was one of considerable shock. Mrs. Venetia Hartwell lay crumpled on the Persian carpet beside the vicar's desk, her elegant coiffure now disheveled, and a spreading pool of blood darkening the fabric beneath her head. Standing over her, white-faced and trembling, was young Mary, the vicarage maid, a heavy brass letter opener gripped in her shaking hand. "I found her like this," Mary gasped, her voice breaking with hysteria. "I came in to dust the study as Mrs. Clement asked, and she was here, and there was blood, and I picked this up thinking to help, but she won't move, she won't speak." Dr. Haydock knelt beside the still form, his examination swift but thorough. When he looked up, his expression was grave. "I'm afraid she's dead. The blow to the head was fatal. We must telephone Inspector Slack immediately." As the inevitable chaos of discovery unfolded around them, guests being ushered back into the garden, servants dispatched to make urgent telephone calls, poor Mary being led away in tears by Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple remained quietly in the doorway, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The position of the body suggested Mrs. Hartwell had been standing near the desk when she was struck. A chair was overturned and several papers had scattered across the floor. But what drew Miss Marple's particular attention was a small, leather-bound notebook that lay partially hidden beneath the desk, as if it had been dropped or thrown there in haste. She could just make out a few words on the open page. "The silent guest knows the truth about Cairo." Most interesting of all, when Miss Marple glanced back toward the garden through the French doors, she noticed that Mr. Geoffrey Pemberton was nowhere to be seen among the shocked guests gathered on the lawn. In all the confusion, he had simply vanished, as quietly and thoroughly as if he had never been at the garden party at all. As the sound of police sirens grew closer, Miss Marple quietly withdrew to allow the official investigation to begin. But her mind was already working, connecting the threads of human behavior she had observed throughout the afternoon. The mysterious Mrs. Hartwell had come to St. Mary Mead with a purpose, and that purpose had involved Mr. Pemberton and secrets from the past. Someone had been desperate enough to kill to keep those secrets buried. Murder Miss Marple reflected as she carefully made her way back to her cottage, was so often a matter of understanding what people were willing to do when their carefully constructed lives were threatened. And if there was one thing she had learned in her long years of observing human nature, it was that the most dangerous secrets were always those that people believed they had successfully left behind. The silent guest, it seemed, had brought more than family memories to the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead. She had brought death. By the time Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham, the vicarage garden had transformed into a buzzing hive of speculation. The inspector swept up the drive with his characteristic blend of self-importance and irritation, scattering the remaining guests who had lingered near the gate in hopes of witnessing official drama. To Slack, the situation appeared refreshingly straightforward. A dead woman, a bloody weapon, and a hysterical servant girl caught in the act. It was precisely the sort of case he appreciated, domestic, tidy, and requiring minimal imagination. Inside the drawing room, where the principal guests had been assembled to provide statements, Mrs. Price Ridley was already holding court with her formidable opinions. "It is exactly as I have always maintained," she declared, her voice carrying over the nervous murmurs. "One simply cannot hire girls from the orphanage and expect civilized behavior. Bad stock, you know. I warned Griselda only last week that Mary had a shifty look about her." "Oh, surely not," Miss Marple protested gently from her corner chair, her knitting bag resting untouched beside her. "Mary may be devastatingly clumsy with china, and she does breathe rather heavily when serving soup, but she has such a gentle heart. She cries if she steps on a beetle." Mrs. Bantry, looking less certain than usual, shook her head. "But Jane, you saw her holding that letter opener, and poor Mrs. Hartwell's head. Well, it takes considerable ferocity to inflict such damage. Or a great deal of panic," Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. She was considering how Mary had held the brass implement, loosely, confusedly, not with the tight grip of someone who had just delivered a violent blow. Moreover, there was the matter of physics. Mary stood barely 5 feet tall, while Mrs. Hartwell had been a statuesque woman. For such a blow to the top of the victim's head, Mary would have required a stool, or Mrs. Hartwell would have needed to be kneeling. Inspector Slack emerged from the study looking flushed with satisfaction. "You ladies may return home now," he announced dismissively. "We have the perpetrator in custody. She claims innocence, naturally. Hysterical nonsense about simply discovering the body, but the evidence speaks clearly. Caught red-handed, as they say." As the guests dispersed, the village communication network began its relentless work. Miss Marple made her way slowly down the high street, ostensibly checking shop prices but actually gauging the community's mood. By the time she reached the fishmongers, the story had already begun its inevitable mutation. Mrs. Hartwell was now variously described as a secret heiress, a foreign spy, or a blackmailer, while Mary had transformed from a simple maid into the leader of a criminal gang. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," Mr. Abbott the fishmonger confided, leaning across his counter. "They're saying it was jealousy over jewelry that drove the girl to violence." "How extraordinary the things people say," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Tell me, Mr. Abbott, did you happen to notice Mr. Pemberton pass by this afternoon? He departed the party rather suddenly." "The writer fellow? Indeed I did. Rushed past about an hour ago, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Didn't even acknowledge me, though he's usually quite courteous. Carrying a heavy valise too, which seemed peculiar for someone attending a garden party." Miss Marple thanked him and continued her walk, her mind working rapidly. Through her housekeeper, Cherry's extensive village connections, she had already learned disturbing details about Mrs. Hartwell's mysterious circumstances. The woman had arrived with virtually no personal belongings, paid cash for a week's accommodation, and provided only a London solicitor's address rather than her own residence. For someone claiming to settle family affairs, she had traveled remarkably light and maintained extraordinary anonymity. Most significantly, one crucial detail remained conspicuously absent from the village gossip: Mr. Geoffrey Pemberton's disappearance. In the excitement surrounding Mary's arrest, his quiet departure had gone largely unnoticed. Yet Miss Marple remembered clearly the moment of recognition between him and Mrs. Hartwell, the carefully controlled conversation about family archives, and, most tellingly, his immediate vanishing act when the murder was discovered. As she reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple paused to consider the evidence. The convenient theory of Mary's guilt satisfied the village's need for safety and order, but it ignored too many inconsistencies. If Mary was innocent, which Miss Marple's long experience with human nature strongly suggested, then the real murderer remained free, perhaps even now packing hastily for departure. The word Cairo from that partially hidden notebook continued to echo in her mind, suggesting secrets from distant places that had somehow reached into peaceful St. Mary Mead with deadly consequences. Whatever Mrs. Venetia Hartwell had known about Mr. Pemberton's past, it had been dangerous enough to kill for. The drama was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. Inspector Slack arrived at Much Benham Police Station the following morning with the satisfied air of a man whose case had practically solved itself. He found Mary huddled in the interview room, her face pale and streaked with tears, clutching a damp handkerchief as though it were a lifeline. To Slack's methodical mind, her distress only confirmed her guilt. Innocent people, he reasoned, didn't collapse so completely under questioning. "Now then, Mary," he began, settling himself across from her with deliberate authority. "Let's have no more of this nonsense about simply finding the body. You were caught red-handed with the murder weapon. The evidence speaks for itself." "I never hurt anyone, sir," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible. "I went to dust the study as Mrs. Clement asked. When I saw her lying there with all that blood, I thought she'd fallen and hurt herself. I picked up the letter opener because it was so close to her head. I was frightened someone might step on it." Slack snorted dismissively. "Very convenient story, but facts are facts, girl. You had motive, probably caught stealing, opportunity, and the weapon was in your hand." What Slack failed to consider, however, was already troubling Dr. Haydock, who had spent the night reviewing his examination of the victim. When he arrived at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after breakfast, his usual cheerful demeanor had given way to professional concern. "Jane, I must speak frankly about this business," he said, accepting her offer of tea. "The medical evidence simply doesn't support Slack's theory. Mrs. Hartwell was struck from behind and above, requiring considerable height and strength. Mary is barely 5 feet tall and weighs perhaps 7 stone. The angle of the blow would have been physically impossible for her to deliver." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused thoughtfully. "How very interesting, Doctor. I had my own reservations, though based on different observations entirely." "There's more," Haydock continued. "I examined Mrs. Hartwell's belongings at the Blue Boar. She'd been receiving threatening letters, 3 of them delivered by hand over the past 2 days. All unsigned, but clearly from someone who wanted her to leave St. Mary Mead immediately." This revelation confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions. After Dr. Haydock departed, she made her own visit to the Blue Boar, where Mrs. Denton, the landlady, was eager to discuss her mysterious former guest. "Such a refined lady, though terribly nervous," Mrs. Denton confided, leading Miss Marple to the room. "Always watching from the window as if expecting someone. Paid cash and gave only a London solicitor's address." Miss Marple examined the threatening letters with particular interest. The handwriting was educated, the paper expensive, and the ink an unusual shade of sepia. More significantly, she discovered a railway timetable with Dover departures carefully marked. Mrs. Hartwell had been planning to leave England. The most startling revelation came when Colonel Melchett arrived at the vicarage later that morning, looking harassed. "Slack's convinced he has his murderer," he told Miss Marple and Griselda, "but we've discovered the victim wasn't who she claimed to be. Her real name was Vanessa Hargreaves, widow of a diplomat who spent years in the Middle East. Why she came here posing as a Hartwell cousin is anyone's guess." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "she was looking for someone she knew from those years abroad." Someone who didn't wish to be found. Speaking of which, Melchett added, we can't locate that writer fellow, Pemberton. His cottage is locked up tight, and he seems to have vanished. Miss Marple's final stop was the post office, where Mrs. Ginch proved as informative as expected. Mr. Pemberton was in quite a state yesterday, she whispered conspiratorially. Sent an urgent telegram to a shipping line in Liverpool. Just 3 words, passage booked, tonight. Rushed out without waiting for his change. As Miss Marple walked home through the grey afternoon, the pieces began forming a clear pattern. A woman with a false identity and a diplomatic past had come to St. Mary Mead pursuing someone from her previous life. That someone had responded with threats, and when those failed, with murder. Mr. Pemberton's hasty flight, booking passage on the very day of the killing, suggested either guilt or terror. The question now was whether he had fled as a murderer escaping justice or as the next intended victim of someone even more dangerous. Either way, poor Mary remained imprisoned for a crime she could not possibly have committed, while the real killer moved freely among them. Miss Marple quickened her pace slightly. There was much work to be done. The revelation that Mrs. Hartwell was actually Vanessa Hargreaves, widow of a diplomat, had transformed the village atmosphere from shocked curiosity to something approaching genuine unease. Inspector Slack's confident assertions about Mary's guilt now seemed increasingly hollow, particularly as Dr. Haydock's medical evidence continued to contradict the official theory. Miss Marple, observing the inspector's growing discomfort with characteristic mildness, decided the time had come for more systematic investigation. Her first call was upon Griselda Clement, whom she found in the morning room looking pale and distracted. The vicar's wife had clearly spent a sleepless night wrestling with the implications of murder occurring in her own home. It feels like such a violation, Miss Marple, Griselda confessed, her usual cheerfulness replaced by genuine distress. Our study, our peaceful afternoon, it's as though we were merely props in someone else's terrible drama. And poor Mary, sitting in that dreadful cell for something she couldn't possibly have done. Indeed, my dear, Miss Marple replied gently. But consider this. Whoever arranged matters chose your study deliberately. They needed somewhere private, somewhere they could be certain of finding Mrs. Hargreaves alone. That suggests someone familiar with the vicarage routine. But who would know that I always ask Mary to dust the study during the garden party? It's such a specific detail. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused thoughtfully. Someone who has attended previous garden parties, perhaps. Someone who has observed your household patterns over time. From the vicarage, Miss Marple made her way to Gossington Hall, where Mrs. Bantry greeted her with barely contained excitement. Jane, I've made the most extraordinary discovery. After our conversation yesterday, I spent the evening going through Arthur's old photograph albums. Look what I found. She produced a sepia photograph showing a group of well-dressed people on what appeared to be a hotel terrace, with palm trees visible in the background. Cairo, 1910, Mrs. Bantry announced triumphantly. Arthur was there for some government conference, and there, quite unmistakably, is our Mrs. Hargreaves. Much younger, of course, but definitely the same woman. Miss Marple studied the photograph carefully. Vanessa Hargreaves stood slightly apart from the main group, engaged in conversation with a slim, well-dressed gentleman whose face was partially shadowed. On the reverse, in Colonel Bantry's careful handwriting, was a list of names: Sir Hubert Blair, Lady Blair, Colonel and Mrs. Redmayne, V. Hargreaves, Mr. Guy Charlton, Mr. Gerald Paxton, Mr. R. Allen, Miss M. Drake. Guy Charlton, Miss Marple murmured. That name seems familiar. Oh, it should be, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. Dreadful scandal about 15 years ago. Financial irregularities, missing funds. He disappeared just before the authorities could arrest him. They say he bankrupted half of Cheltenham before vanishing without a trace. Miss Marple's next stop was the village library, where she spent an hour carefully reviewing old newspapers and diplomatic records. Her research confirmed Mrs. Bantry's account and revealed additional details. Guy Charlton had been involved in questionable financial dealings while serving as a minor diplomatic attaché in Cairo. His disappearance had coincided with Vanessa Hargreaves' testimony before a consular inquiry, testimony that had apparently cleared him of the most serious charges, while simultaneously destroying his career. The pattern was becoming clearer. Vanessa Hargreaves possessed knowledge that could ruin someone who had spent years building a new identity. Her arrival in St. Mary Mead suggested she had discovered where that someone was hiding. But the most significant revelation came from an unexpected source. Raymond West, Miss Marple's nephew, arrived from London with information gathered through his literary connections. "I made some inquiries about your Mr. Pemberton," he announced. "Rather interesting fellow, actually. His real name appears to be Major Geoffrey Sinclair, formerly of the diplomatic service. Resigned under somewhat mysterious circumstances around 1910, something involving missing documents and a scandal in Cairo." "Cairo again," Miss Marple observed quietly. "There's more. He's been living under assumed names for years. Geoffrey Pemberton is just his latest identity. And here's the curious thing, he packed and left his cottage hours before attending your garden party. The station master confirms he had already purchased a ticket for the evening train to Liverpool before the murder even occurred." This revelation struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. A man who packed for departure before attending a social gathering was either planning to flee immediately afterward or expecting something to happen that would necessitate immediate flight. Either interpretation suggested foreknowledge of violence, yet something about the scenario troubled her. If Sinclair Pemberton had murdered Mrs. Hargreaves to silence her, why attend the garden party at all? Why not simply kill her privately and disappear? His presence at the vicarage, his careful positioning to avoid her, and his vanishing act only after the body was discovered suggested a more complex calculation than simple murder and flight. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat in her garden contemplating the emerging pattern. A woman with dangerous knowledge had confronted a man with a false identity. One of them was now dead, the other had vanished. But the careful staging of Mary's apparent guilt suggested someone else entirely. Someone still present in the village, someone who had used the confrontation between past enemies to eliminate a threat while deflecting suspicion onto an innocent servant. The real murderer, Miss Marple suspected, was still among them. The following morning found Miss Marple in her small sitting room, carefully arranging her correspondence while awaiting Colonel Melchett's promised visit. She had learned over the years that official gentlemen often revealed more than they intended when they believed they were merely reassuring concerned elderly ladies about village safety. Colonel Melchett arrived looking considerably more harassed than during their previous encounter, his usual military bearing somewhat diminished by the weight of an increasingly complex case. "Confound it all, Miss Marple," he began without preamble, settling heavily into her offered chair. "This business grows more tangled by the hour. We've had a burglary at Pemberton's cottage. During the night." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused delicately. "How very interesting, Colonel. And what did the burglar seek, do you suppose?" "That's precisely the difficulty. Nothing of obvious value was taken. The wireless remains along with some rather fine silver pieces. But the place was ransacked systematically, every drawer emptied, papers scattered, even floorboards pried up in places. Someone was searching desperately for something specific." Melchett accepted her offer of tea with a grateful nod. Mrs. Miller next door heard the disturbance around 3 in the morning but was too frightened to investigate. Professional work, by all appearances. The lock was picked expertly. "How curious that someone should know exactly when to search," Miss Marple observed mildly. "It suggests they were quite certain Mr. Pemberton would not return unexpectedly." Before Melchett could respond, Griselda Clement appeared at the garden gate, looking unusually flustered. "Oh, Miss Marple, I do hope I'm not intruding, but the most peculiar thing has happened. You remember that strange letter Leonard received yesterday morning, the one with the biblical quotation? Well, it's vanished from his study. We've searched everywhere, but it's simply gone." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "How very significant. Could you recall the exact quotation, my dear?" "Numbers 32:23. Be sure your sin will find you out." Leonard thought it was from one of the stricter parishioners, but now— Griselda's voice trailed off uncertainly. After Griselda departed, Colonel Melchett regarded Miss Marple with growing respect. "You think the letter and the burglary are connected?" "I think, Colonel, that someone has been very busy indeed, first ensuring that Mr. Pemberton departed the village, then searching his cottage for incriminating evidence, and finally removing any traces of their own correspondence from the vicarage. Such thoroughness suggests considerable planning." Miss Marple's afternoon constitutional took her past the post office, where she collected a telegram from Bournemouth. Mrs. Marjorie Drake's response was brief but illuminating. "Remember, Vanessa, well stop Guy Charlton embezzled diplomatic funds. Cairo 1910, stop Vanessa testified at inquiry. Stop Charlton, disappeared before arrest. Stop heard rumors, he assumed new identity. Stop will write details. Stop." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a clearer picture. Vanessa Hargreaves had possessed dangerous knowledge about financial crimes committed 15 years ago. Her arrival in St. Mary Mead suggested she had discovered where Guy Charlton was hiding under his new identity as Geoffrey Pemberton. But as Miss Marple made her way home through the lengthening shadows, she noticed something that made her pause beside her own garden hedge. The branches had been disturbed recently, and caught on a thorn was a small scrap of dark blue wool. Expensive material, the sort used in gentlemen's overcoats. More significantly, half buried in the soft earth beneath, lay a tarnished silver cigarette case. Opening it carefully with her handkerchief, she found an inscription inside the lid: "To G.S. from Via Cairo, 1910. Here was tangible proof of the connection between Geoffrey Sinclair and Vanessa Hargreaves. A gift from happier times, now discarded near her cottage in what appeared to be haste or struggle. The implications were troubling. If the cigarette case had been dropped here, it suggested that whatever had happened to Mr. Pemberton had occurred very close to her own home. The proximity was hardly coincidental. Someone had been watching her cottage, perhaps aware of her reputation for solving mysteries and concerned about her involvement. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat in her parlor contemplating the evidence. The cottage burglary, the missing biblical quotation, and the discarded cigarette case all pointed to the same conclusion. Someone in St. Mary Mead had known exactly who Vanessa Hargreaves and Geoffrey Sinclair really were, long before the murder occurred. This person had carefully orchestrated events to eliminate both threats, while ensuring that an innocent servant girl took the blame. The murderer was not some distant figure from a diplomatic scandal 15 years past. They were someone who lived among them, someone who attended garden parties and exchanged pleasantries about the weather, someone who understood village routines well enough to predict exactly when the vicarage study would be empty and when Mary would discover the body. Most chilling of all, this person was still free, still moving among the unsuspecting residents of St. Mary Mead, congratulating themselves on having successfully closed a dangerous chapter from their past. But as Miss Marple had learned through long experience with human nature, the past had a way of refusing to stay buried, and murderers, however clever, inevitably made the mistake of believing themselves safer than they actually were. The silent guest who never left was about to be revealed. Miss Marple did not immediately rush to Colonel Melchett with the cigarette case. Experience had taught her that premature revelations often allowed guilty parties to construct new deceptions, and she suspected that the murderer was already feeling dangerously confident about having successfully framed poor Mary. Instead, she placed the evidence carefully in her writing desk and set about what appeared to be her usual round of village errands, though each stop was chosen with deliberate purpose. Her first call was at the chemist's, where Mr. Davies proved as informative as she had hoped. While discussing a prescription for her rheumatism, she mentioned having seen some rather distinctive sepia ink recently. "Such an unusual shade," she observed mildly. "One doesn't often encounter it nowadays." Mr. Davies brightened with professional interest. "Indeed not, Miss Marple. I stock it for only one customer in the village. Mr. Pemberton was most particular about that exact shade. Foreign manufacture, quite expensive. He ordered it regularly. Said ordinary ink wouldn't do for his historical documents." The chemist paused thoughtfully. "Though, come to think of it, someone else inquired about that same ink just last week. Claimed they needed to match some old correspondence." This revelation sent a chill through Miss Marple's methodical mind. The threatening letters to Vanessa Hargreaves had been written in sepia ink. But if Mr. Pemberton had been the only regular purchaser, and someone else had recently sought the same shade, it suggested the murderer had deliberately chosen to implicate him. The psychological calculation was both clever and revealing. Her next visit was to Mrs. Price Ridley, who received her with barely concealed satisfaction at having an audience for her theories about the murder. During their conversation, Miss Marple learnt something particularly significant. Mrs. Price Ridley had been instrumental in establishing Mr. Pemberton's respectability when he first arrived in St. Mary Mead. "I made quite thorough inquiries about his credentials," Mrs. Price Ridley announced proudly. "One cannot be too careful about newcomers. His references were impeccable. Letters from London solicitors, testimonials from historical societies. I personally vouched for his character to the village committee." "How very thorough of you," Miss Marple murmured. "And who provided these excellent references?" "Why, Mr. Allen at White Gables handled all the arrangements. Such a distinguished gentleman with his diplomatic background. He assured me that Mr. Pemberton was exactly the sort of resident our village needed." This information added another layer to Miss Marple's growing understanding. Robert Allen, the respected solicitor who had handled Pemberton's cottage purchase, had also orchestrated his social acceptance in the village. For someone who claimed no prior knowledge of the writer, Mr. Allen had shown remarkable interest in his successful integration into St. Mary Mead society. The afternoon brought Dr. Haydock with disturbing news. He had discovered a man's shoe near the old quarry, expensive leather, bearing traces of blood and matching the style Mr. Pemberton habitually wore. "I'm afraid our missing writer never made it to Liverpool," Haydock said grimly. "The quarry's been flooded for years. If someone weighted a body down there—" Miss Marple absorbed this revelation with characteristic calm, though inwardly she felt a deep sadness. Geoffrey Sinclair, whatever his past mistakes, had not deserved such an end. The discovery confirmed her growing theory. The murderer had killed both Vanessa Hargreaves and Geoffrey Sinclair, using the chaos of the garden party to cover the first murder, and Sinclair's planned departure to disguise the second. Her final investigative stop was the parish church, where she examined the register with the vicar's bemused permission. "I'm researching family connections," she explained, though her true purpose was more specific. The entries from 1911 revealed that Robert Allen had arrived in St. Mary Mead shortly after the Cairo scandal broke, establishing himself quickly as a pillar of respectability. Most tellingly, his signature in the register showed the same distinctive formation of capital letters she had observed in the threatening notes found in Vanessa's room. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat in her garden contemplating the complete picture that had emerged. Robert Allen, whose presence in the Cairo photograph suggested he was actually Gerald Paxton, the third man involved in the diplomatic scandal, had built a new life in St. Mary Mead. When Vanessa Hargreaves arrived with dangerous knowledge of his past, he had seen an opportunity not merely to silence her, but to eliminate Geoffrey Sinclair as well, using their old enmity as cover for his crimes. The plan had been ingeniously cruel. Murder Vanessa at the garden party where the innocent Mary would discover the body, then lure Geoffrey to his death later that evening. The sepia ink the biblical quotation, the systematic burglary. All had been calculated to create false trails while deflecting suspicion onto others. But murderers, however clever, inevitably made mistakes born of overconfidence. Alan had not anticipated that anyone would notice his role in vouching for Pemberton's respectability, or connect his access to sepia ink, or examine parish records closely enough to match his handwriting. Most crucially, he had underestimated the persistence of an elderly lady with a deep understanding of human nature. Miss Marple rose from her chair with quiet determination. The time had come to set a trap, and she knew exactly how to appeal to a killer's greatest weakness, the belief that they had committed the perfect crime. Miss Marple's trap began with what appeared to be nothing more than an elderly lady's confusion about legal matters. She dispatched a carefully worded note to Robert Allen that morning, requesting his professional assistance with some puzzling documents discovered among family papers, and suggesting tea at her cottage that afternoon. A respected solicitor could hardly refuse such a reasonable request without arousing suspicion. Allen arrived at 4 o'clock precisely, his distinguished bearing and silver hair lending him the air of unimpeachable respectability that had served him so well for 15 years. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who believed his secrets safely buried along with those who might expose them. The gentle interrogation. "Mr. Allen, how delightful," Miss Marple said warmly, settling him in her sitting room with tea and her finest china. "You mentioned in your note some documents requiring legal expertise?" "Indeed, such a curious coincidence, really." Miss Marple's tone remained pleasantly vague as she poured tea with hands that trembled just enough to suggest harmless, elderly frailty. "I've been organizing some old correspondence, and I discovered the most interesting photograph from Cairo in 1910. Perhaps you might help me identify some of the people?" She watched his face carefully as she produced the photograph Mrs. Bantry had lent her. For just an instant, his professional composure faltered, a brief tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible stiffening of his shoulders, but he recovered quickly, examining the photograph with apparent casual interest. "Cairo, you say? I'm afraid I've never visited Egypt myself, Miss Marple. Fascinating period of history, of course, but I couldn't possibly identify these people." "How strange," Miss Marple murmured, her knitting needles clicking gently. "Because you see, this gentleman here, the one standing beside Mrs. Hargreaves, is identified on the reverse as Mr. Gerald Paxton. And the resemblance to yourself is quite remarkable, allowing for the passage of years, naturally. The evidence unfolds." Allen's laugh was smooth, practiced. A coincidence of names, surely. Paxton is hardly uncommon, and these old photographs can be so unclear. Of course. Though I must confess, I've been quite troubled by this whole dreadful business with poor Mrs. Hargreaves. Such a small world when 3 people from the same Cairo photograph find themselves in St. Mary Mead, and 2 of them end up dead. Such a tragic coincidence. The silence that followed was weighted with unspoken understanding. Allen set down his teacup with careful precision, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost much of its warmth. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "Oh, I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Allen. Or should I say Mr. Paxton? I'm merely observing patterns." She paused to examine her knitting. "For instance, the matter of that distinctive sepia ink used in the threatening letters to Mrs. Hargreaves. Mr. Davies at the chemist's remembers selling it twice recently, once to Mr. Pemberton for his historical work, and once to someone else who claimed they needed to match old correspondence." Allen's eyes had grown cold, calculating. Mere coincidence. The trap springs. Perhaps. Though there's also the matter of handwriting. The biblical quotation that mysteriously disappeared from the vicar's desk, "Be sure your sin will find you out," was written in the same distinctive hand as those threatening notes. I recognize the particular way you form your capital letters from your signature in the parish register. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her blue eyes sharp and unwavering. You see, Mr. Paxton, you made several small mistakes. You vouched for Mr. Pemberton's respectability when he arrived, handled his cottage purchase, arranged his references. Rather odd for someone who claimed no prior acquaintance. And then there's this. She produced the silver cigarette case, wrapped carefully in a tissue paper. Found in my garden hedge, inscribed to G.S. from V.H., Cairo, 1910. It must have fallen from your pocket when you were disposing of Mr. Pemberton's body. You couldn't risk it being found at his cottage. That would raise entirely the wrong questions. The confrontation. Alan rose slowly, his mask of respectability finally slipping away entirely. You meddling old woman, you have no idea how dangerous this is for you. On the contrary, Miss Marple replied with perfect calm. I understand exactly what I'm dealing with. A man who embezzled diplomatic funds in Cairo, assumed a false identity, and built a respectable life on stolen money. When Vanessa Hargreaves recognized you and threatened exposure, you saw an opportunity to eliminate both her and Geoffrey Sinclair while framing an innocent servant girl. She continued knitting as if discussing the weather. You killed Mrs. Hargreaves during the garden party, when you knew the study would be empty and Mary would discover the body. You used the sepia ink to implicate Mr. Pemberton, then murdered him when he tried to flee. The perfect crime, you thought. Two old enemies eliminating each other. Alan's composure shattered completely. You cannot prove any of this. Perhaps not, though I should mention that Colonel Melchett is currently obtaining a warrant to search your premises. I believe he expects to find the documents you removed from Mr. Pemberton's cottage, along with other incriminating evidence. Justice arrives. Before Alan could respond, the cottage door opened, and Colonel Melchett stepped inside, accompanied by 2 constables. His timing was no coincidence. Miss Marple had arranged the entire confrontation as a carefully orchestrated trap. Robert Allen, Melchett announced grimly, I'm arresting you for the murders of Vanessa Hargreaves and Geoffrey Sinclair. We found blood-stained clothing and stolen documents hidden in your cellar, along with correspondence proving your true identity as Gerald Paxton. As the handcuffs clicked shut, Alan's gaze remained fixed on Miss Marple with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. How could you possibly know all this? Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with gentle sadness. Because, Mr. Paxton, you underestimated the power of careful observation. In villages like St. Mary Mead, we notice everything. Who buys what ink, who vouches for whom, who changes their habits when they're frightened. Human nature is the same everywhere, whether in Cairo or here. And guilt, like murder, will always find a way to reveal itself. Aftermath and reflection. As the police led the defeated murderer away, Miss Marple sat quietly in her sitting room, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across her knitting. The mystery was solved, justice would be served, and poor Mary would be released from her nightmare. But the tragedy of 3 lives destroyed by greed and secrets from the past would leave its mark on the peaceful village. The silent guest who had never left Marple Cottage was not Mrs. Hargreaves at all, but the ghost of past crimes that had finally caught up with a man who thought himself safely hidden behind a facade of respectability. In the end, it was not the law or official investigation that had exposed him, but the patient observation of human nature by an elderly lady who understood that the truth, however deeply buried, always finds a way to surface. Murder, Miss Marple reflected as she resumed her knitting, was so often simply a matter of understanding what people were willing to do when their carefully constructed lies were threatened. And there was no lie so elaborate that it could withstand the quiet persistence of someone who truly understood the human heart. The arrest of Robert Allen sent shockwaves through St. Mary Mead that reverberated far beyond the initial scandal of murder. For a village that prided itself on knowing everything about everyone, The realization that their respected solicitor had lived among them for 15 years as Gerald Paxton, a fugitive embezzler, challenged the very foundation of their comfortable assumptions about respectability and character. The village reacts. Within hours of Alan's arrest, the village telegraph had disseminated the basic facts, though naturally embellished with considerable speculation. Mrs. Price Ridley, characteristically, was already rewriting history to preserve her dignity, claiming she had always suspected something wasn't quite right about that man, despite having personally vouched for his character on numerous occasions. Miss Marple observed this human tendency toward self-preservation with her usual gentle understanding. People so often preferred stories that made them feel safe, even when those stories required convenient lapses of memory. Mary's liberation. The most immediate relief came with Mary's release from custody. Griselda Clement brought her directly to the vicarage, where Miss Marple found her sitting by the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea like an anchor. The girl was pale and bewildered, still processing her ordeal. "You're quite safe now, Mary," Miss Marple said gently. "No one believes you capable of such a thing." Mary's eyes filled with tears. "But they did, ma'am. For days they did. Even when I told the truth, it didn't matter. It was like the truth had shrunk smaller than their ideas of me." Inspector Slack had actually apologized, a remarkable development that spoke to the strength of the evidence Miss Marple had assembled. The vicar insisted on giving Mary a raise and a week's recovery time, small gestures that helped restore some faith in human decency after such a traumatic experience. The full confession. Colonel Melchett arrived that afternoon with the complete details of Alan's confession. The man had revealed everything, not from remorse, but from the realization that the evidence was overwhelming. His real identity as Gerald Paxton was confirmed, along with his embezzlement of diplomatic funds in Cairo 15 years earlier. Most significantly, the confession revealed that Vanessa Hargreaves had not come to St. Mary Mead as a blackmailer, as Alan claimed in his defense. The letters found in his possession told a different story entirely. She had written, asking him to confess voluntarily, offering to help him make restitution for the stolen funds. Her approach had been motivated by religious conviction and genuine concern for his redemption, making her brutal murder even more tragic. Miss Marple's analysis. Dr. Haydock, still puzzled by certain aspects of the case, sought Miss Marple's explanation of how she had unraveled Alan's deception. "What I don't understand," he confessed, "is how you were so certain about the ink connection." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "It wasn't just the ink, Doctor. It was the pattern. Mr. Paxton made the classic mistake of trying to be too clever. By using sepia ink for the threatening letters, he intended to frame Mr. Pemberton, but he forgot that a historian uses such ink openly for his work. A man planning murder doesn't typically advertise his methods beforehand." She continued her analysis with characteristic precision. The biblical quotation was perhaps his greatest error. "Be sure your sin will find you out" wasn't a threat to the vicar, as everyone assumed. It was something from his own papers, carelessly left during one of his visits. When he realized it might be recognized as his handwriting, his desperation to retrieve it drew more attention than leaving it would have done. The deeper truth. What had ultimately exposed Alan was his very perfection. Miss Marple explained to her nephew Raymond during his evening telephone call. A solicitor who arrives with no past, no family, and immediately becomes the most respectable man in town. People who have nothing to hide usually have messy lives, full of small contradictions. Mr. Paxton's life was too tidy, too carefully curated, like a stage set rather than a home. Philosophical reflections. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her garden contemplating the human wreckage left by one man's determination to protect his stolen life. 3 people were dead. Vanessa, who had sought redemption, Geoffrey Sinclair, who had been fleeing his own mistakes, and Gerald Paxton himself, who had died the moment he chose murder to preserve Robert Allen's existence. The case offered profound lessons about the nature of respectability and virtue. Allen had constructed his facade with the careful attention of an architect, maintaining it for 15 years without a crack appearing. But respectability, Miss Marple reflected, was no guarantee of virtue, and the most dangerous criminals were often those who had successfully convinced society of their fundamental decency. Return to peace. The village would recover, as villages always did. The scandal would fade into local legend, embellished with each retelling until truth became ghost story. But the essential lesson remained, that guilt, like oil in water, always rises to the surface eventually. The silent guest who never left had been conscience itself, patient and inexorable, waiting for the moment when past and present would collide with deadly consequences. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, satisfied that justice had been served and the pattern was complete. The discovery of Geoffrey Sinclair's body in the flooded quarry 3 days later brought the final grim confirmation to the case that had shattered St. Mary Mead's peaceful facade. Divers found him weighted down with chains, his suitcase filled with stones, a methodical disposal that spoke to Gerald Paxton's calculating nature. The post-mortem revealed he had been struck from behind with the same brass letter opener that had killed Vanessa Hargreaves, confirming Miss Marple's deduction that both murders were the work of one desperate man. The village processes. Truth. Inspector Slack's second visit to Miss Marple carried a different tone entirely from his usual brusque efficiency. He appeared genuinely subdued as he shared the reconstructed timeline of that fatal evening. Paxton sent Sinclair an anonymous note during the garden party, claiming to have information that would clear his name. Suggested they meet at the quarry after dark, away from prying eyes. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Sinclair was already planning to flee, so he must have been desperate for any explanation. He couldn't have known he was walking into a trap designed to silence him permanently. I misjudged the business with Mary, Slack admitted, his professional pride clearly wounded. Went straight for the simple explanation. Blood, weapon, hysterical servant girl seemed plain enough at the time. That is very natural, Inspector. Miss Marple replied kindly. We all prefer simple explanations. Only human nature is seldom simple. Mary's terror was of being suspected, not of being found out. It is a very different thing entirely. Uncovering deeper motivations. The investigation's final revelations painted a complex picture of the three principals. Documents recovered from Paxton's safe showed that Sinclair had been quietly blackmailing him for nearly a decade, extracting small regular payments in exchange for his silence about the Cairo embezzlement. Vanessa Hargreaves' correspondence, however, told a different story entirely. Her letters to Paxton, written over several months before her arrival, revealed a woman of considerable moral courage who had wrestled with her conscience before deciding to approach him privately rather than going to the authorities. She had sought not revenge but redemption, asking him to confess voluntarily and make amends for his past crimes. She wasn't seeking justice in the legal sense, Griselda observed when Miss Marple shared these details. She wanted his spiritual redemption. How tragic that such compassion was met with murder. The silent guest revealed the most poignant discovery came among Vanessa's few possessions at the Blue Boar. Inspector Slack had dismissively allowed Miss Marple to take a small leather case, assuming it contained merely sentimental trifles. Inside, however, were watercolor paintings, amateur but deeply felt depictions of Egyptian deserts, busy Cairo streets, and finally, the green rolling hills of St. Mary Mead. The last painting, unfinished, showed the view from the vicarage garden, peaceful and bright. Tucked into the case's lining was an unsealed letter addressed simply to the lady with the kind eyes. Intended, Miss Marple realized with deep sadness, for herself. Though they had exchanged only brief pleasantries at the garden party, Vanessa had recognized a kindred spirit. If you are reading this, the elegant script began, it means my courage failed me, or perhaps that my past has finally claimed me. I came here seeking justice, but I found I wanted peace more. There is a silence in this village that I have longed for, not the silence of secrets, but the silence of rest. Village recovery and reflection. As the official investigation concluded, St. Mary Mead began its characteristic process of healing and reinterpretation. Mary returned to work but remained fragile, the experience of false accusation having shaken her faith in basic fairness. The villagers showed excessive kindness to compensate for their earlier suspicions, though Miss Marple observed that innocence proved was not quite the same as innocence never questioned. Mrs. Price Ridley had taken to her bed with what she termed nervous prostration, though Miss Marple suspected it was primarily embarrassment at having vouched so thoroughly for a murderer and embezzler. The village's self-appointed arbiter of respectability would require considerable time to recover from such a humiliation. The pattern complete. That evening, sitting by her fireplace with Vanessa's watercolors nearby, Miss Marple reflected on the deeper patterns the case had revealed. Gerald Paxton had demonstrated how easily respectability could be counterfeited, how a carefully maintained facade could deceive even the most suspicious observers. But he had also proved that guilt created its own pressures. The very perfection of his disguise had ultimately contributed to its unraveling. The silent guest who never left had been the past itself, patient and inexorable, waiting for the moment when old crimes would demand their reckoning. Vanessa Hargreaves had come seeking not scandal but sanctuary, hoping to find peace in the village's gentle rhythms after facilitating justice for ancient wrongs. Murder, Miss Marple concluded as she carefully stored the paintings away, was so often about understanding what people were willing to sacrifice to protect their carefully constructed lives. In this case, a man had sacrificed everything, his false respectability, his freedom, and ultimately his soul, rather than face the truth about who he really was. The case was closed, but its lessons would linger in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead, a reminder that beneath the surface of the most ordinary lives, extraordinary secrets might be waiting to surface. The trial of Gerald Paxton concluded on a grey November morning with the inevitable guilty verdict that surprised no one in St. Mary Mead. The judge's sentence of life imprisonment brought a collective sigh of relief to the village, though Miss Marple noted that justice, however necessary, could never truly restore what had been lost. 3 lives had been destroyed by one man's determination to protect a lie, built on 15-year-old crimes. By Christmas, the village had largely returned to its familiar rhythms, though subtle changes lingered like morning frost that never quite melted. Mary had found new employment with a dressmaker in Much Benham, her gentle hands proving remarkably skilled with delicate fabrics. When she visited the vicarage for tea, Miss Marple observed that the girl carried herself with quiet dignity, her ordeal having taught her valuable lessons about both human cruelty and human kindness. Mrs. Price Ridley had emerged from her self-imposed seclusion considerably humbled, no longer quite so confident in her pronouncements about character and respectability. She had learned the uncomfortable truth that surfaces could be desperately deceiving and that 15 years of apparent virtue could mask the blackest intentions. The deeper resolution. One afternoon in early spring, Raymond West found his aunt in her garden, tending to the first shoots of daffodils with characteristic patience. "The whole business still fascinates me, Aunt Jane," he said, settling beside her on the garden bench. "How did you know so early that Alan wasn't what he seemed?" Miss Marple's needles paused thoughtfully over her knitting. "It wasn't intuition, my dear Raymond, though people often assume it was. It was simply observation. A man who arrives with no past, no family connections, and immediately becomes the most respectable person in town. Real respectability usually comes with messy complications, difficult relatives, embarrassing memories, small contradictions. Mr. Paxton's life was too perfectly curated, like a stage set rather than a home. She resumed her gentle stitching, watching a robin investigate the freshly turned earth. But what struck me most was his reaction to Mrs. Hargreaves at the garden party. Recognition, followed by careful avoidance, that suggested shared history he preferred to forget. When someone goes to such lengths to hide from their past, it's usually because that past contains something worth hiding from. The silent guest revealed. And the silent guest from her notebook? Raymond asked. Ah, that was the key to everything, Miss Marple replied with satisfaction. The silent guest who never left wasn't a person at all. It was the past itself. Vanessa Hargreaves brought it with her from Cairo, but it refused to depart even after her death. It sat in our parlors, walked our streets, and whispered in guilty consciences until truth finally emerged. She set down her knitting to watch the peaceful village scene before them. Mr. Paxton thought he could eliminate the past by eliminating its messenger, but he failed to understand that guilt creates its own pressures. The very perfection of his disguise ultimately contributed to its unraveling. He had lived a lie for so long that he couldn't distinguish between Robert Allen and Gerald Paxton anymore. Closing wisdom. As evening shadows lengthened across the cottage garden, Miss Marple reflected on the universal patterns the case had revealed. Villages everywhere contained hidden histories, carefully buried secrets, and people living under assumed identities of various sorts. Most deceptions were harmless, small vanities and minor embellishments that helped people endure disappointing realities. But occasionally, as with Paxton, the deception was built on genuine crime, and maintaining it created pressures that eventually erupted into violence. The case had demonstrated both the worst and best of human nature. A calculated murder alongside genuine compassion, cruel deception balanced by persistent courage. Will there be other mysteries, do you think? Raymond asked as they walked toward the cottage. Miss Marple smiled with gentle certainty. Human nature guarantees it, my dear. The same patterns repeat endlessly across time and place. Greed, fear, the willingness to sacrifice others for self-protection. But also compassion, courage, and the persistent hope for redemption, as poor Mrs. Hargreaves demonstrated. She paused at her garden gate, looking back at the village where lamplight was beginning to glow in cottage windows. The silent guest has departed for now, but the door must remain unlocked. One never knows when the past might come calling again, or when someone will imagine they can hide their sins behind a respectable facade. The mystery was closed, but Miss Marple knew that beneath St. Mary Mead's peaceful surface, other secrets waited. Other deceptions maintained their precarious balance. When the next puzzle arrived, and it would, inevitably, she would be ready, armed with her knitting, her tea, and her profound understanding of the endlessly fascinating, eternally predictable human heart. The anniversary of the tragedy arrived with the return of the June roses, their crimson heads nodding heavily in the warm breeze that swept through St. Mary Mead. The village had gathered once again on the vicarage lawn for the annual summer fete, driven by that peculiar English determination to carry on, regardless of past unpleasantness. Yet Miss Marple, seated beneath the ancient elm with her knitting, observed the subtle changes that time and truth had wrought upon her neighbors. The village transformed. The healing had been gradual but unmistakable. Griselda Clement moved among her guests with a new maturity, her youthful carelessness replaced by thoughtful grace. She paused frequently to check on Mary, who was serving tea with a confidence that would have seemed impossible 12 months prior. The girl had blossomed under the protection of Vanessa Hargreaves' unexpected legacy, a charitable fund established specifically for wrongly accused servants throughout England, administered through a trust that had already helped dozens of vulnerable people defend themselves against false charges. Mrs. Price Ridley, though still formidable, carried herself with less certainty than before. Her pronouncements about character now carried careful qualifications, and she had developed the habit of pausing mid-sentence to reconsider her words. The lesson that 15 years of apparent respectability could mask the blackest intentions had not been lost on St. Mary Mead's self-appointed arbiter of virtue. Inspector Slack, arriving late and reluctant at Griselda's pointed invitation, took his seat with visible discomfort. When Mary's name arose naturally in conversation, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "She came to see me, you know, after it was all over. Said she'd forgiven me for suspecting her. Said I did what I thought was right." He looked genuinely puzzled by grace he felt unworthy to receive. Funny thing, being forgiven when you're not at all sure you deserve it. Most of us, Miss Marple observed gently, can be very grateful that we do not receive only what we deserve. Letters from the past. The spring had brought unexpected revelations in the form of correspondence. A solicitor from London had delivered Vanessa Hargreaves' final wishes, revealing a woman of remarkable foresight who had sensed the danger approaching. Beyond the charitable fund, she had left Mary a personal bequest sufficient to complete professional training, along with a letter written weeks before her death. She knew, Mary had whispered when Miss Marple visited her thriving dressmaking shop in Much Benham. She wrote that innocent people often suffer most because they lack the imagination to defend themselves against those who understand deception. She wanted me to have choices, to never feel trapped again. More surprising still was the letter that had arrived from Gerald Paxton himself, written from prison with painful honesty. "You were correct in your assessment," he had written to Miss Marple. "I became so adept at playing Robert Allen that I forgot Gerald Paxton had ever existed. When Vanessa appeared, she wasn't threatening exposure. She was offering salvation. She asked me to confess voluntarily, to make restitution, to reclaim my actual identity rather than hiding behind a stolen one." The letter had concluded with a haunting question. Can a man who has lived a lie for 15 years ever reclaim his true self? Or does the performance eventually consume the performer entirely? The silent guest revealed. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the vicarage lawn, Miss Marple reflected on the complete pattern the case had revealed. In her cottage drawing-room, Vanessa Hargreaves' unfinished watercolor of St. Mary Mead hung above the mantelpiece, the silent guest who had never truly left. The painting captured the village in peaceful afternoon light, its gentle brush strokes a permanent reminder that even in the face of danger, there were those who sought beauty and truth. "The silent guest," Miss Marple murmured as she packed away her knitting, "was never a person at all. It was conscience itself, patient, inexorable, refusing to be silenced by murder or deception." The case had demonstrated both the worst and best of human nature. Calculated murder alongside genuine compassion, cruel deception balanced by persistent courage. Gerald Paxton had shown how thoroughly one could deceive others while remaining unable to deceive oneself, choosing murder over the redemption Vanessa offered because her compassion demanded he acknowledge his humanity. Eternal patterns. As twilight settled over the peaceful village, Miss Marple walked home through streets where lamplight was beginning to glow in cottage windows. The mystery was closed, but she knew that beneath St. Mary, Mead's restored tranquility, other secrets waited, other deceptions maintained their precarious balance. Human nature guaranteed it. The same patterns of greed, fear, and the willingness to sacrifice others for self-protection would repeat endlessly. But so, too, would the equally human capacity for compassion, courage, and the persistent hope for redemption. Vanessa Hargreaves had come seeking peace and had ultimately given it to them all, her legacy living on in Mary's confident smile, in the village's hard-won wisdom about the complexity of human character, and in the quiet reminder that truth, however long delayed, always finds its way to the surface. The silent guest had finally departed, leaving behind lessons about the terrible cost of living a lie and the redemptive power of facing truth, however late that facing might come. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, ever understanding, settled into her cottage knowing that when the next puzzle arrived, as it inevitably would, she would be ready with her knitting, her tea, and her profound faith in the endlessly fascinating, eternally predictable human heart. 2 years had passed since the terrible summer that had shattered St. Mary Mead's peaceful facade, and the village had achieved that peculiar English equilibrium where tragedy becomes simply another layer in the accumulated wisdom of a place. Miss Marple, now moving with slightly more deliberation but her mind as sharp as ever, sat in her garden on a crisp October afternoon, her knitting needles moving with their characteristic rhythm as she contemplated the enduring lessons of what the village had come to call the Hargreaves affair. The village transformed. The healing had been gradual, but unmistakable. People now spoke of dates in 2 ways, before that dreadful business and since we learned about Mr. Allen. The change was subtle but profound. St. Mary Mead's unquestioning faith in outward respectability had suffered a permanent, if salutary, blow. Mrs. Price Ridley, though still formidable, carried herself with less certainty than before. Her pronouncements about character now carried careful qualifications, and she had developed the habit of pausing mid-sentence to reconsider her words. Mary had blossomed beyond all expectations. Now married to a respectable young man from Much Benham, she ran a thriving dressmaking establishment that employed 3 assistants, all young women who had faced unjust accusations in their own lives. The Hargreaves Fund had grown substantially under her passionate advocacy, providing legal assistance to dozens of servants wrongly suspected of crimes throughout England. When she visited the vicarage for tea, Miss Marple observed that the girl carried herself with quiet dignity, her ordeal having taught her valuable lessons about both human cruelty and human kindness. Inspector Slack had taken early retirement, though he occasionally visited St. Mary Mead with a humility that would have been unthinkable before the case. "I look for what doesn't fit now," he had confessed to Miss Marple during his last visit, rather than rushing toward what seems obvious. "You taught me that human nature is never as simple as we'd like it to be." The final revelation. That very morning had brought an unexpected discovery. The new tenants of what had been Geoffrey Sinclair's cottage, a young couple named Miller, had found a leather-bound diary wedged behind a loose skirting board while renovating the nursery. Recognizing the name on the flyleaf, they had brought it immediately to Miss Marple, sensing instinctively that she was the repository for all such village artifacts. The diary entries were sporadic, written in Sinclair's cramped, nervous hand, but they provided the final missing piece of psychological context. Sinclair had not merely been a blackmailer. He had been a man consumed by a peculiar form of envy, watching Gerald Paxton's successful transformation into Robert Allen with a mixture of resentment and awe. He plays the role better than the reality. One entry read, dated 3 months before the murders. "I watch him at the church fete, handing out prizes, smiling that benevolent smile. He believes it himself now. That is his strength and his madness. I am merely a ghost haunting his performance, reminding him that the stage is built on quicksand." This insight struck Miss Marple as profoundly illuminating. It explained why Paxton had taken such desperate risks to eliminate Sinclair, not just for the financial drain, but because Sinclair was the mirror reflecting the ugly truth Paxton had spent 15 years trying to smash. Gerald Paxton's end. Gerald Paxton had died in prison the previous winter, his health broken by the weight of guilt he had carried for nearly 2 decades. His final letter to Miss Marple, written days before his death, had contained a remarkable confession. "You were correct in everything. I became so thoroughly Robert Allen that Gerald Paxton ceased to exist, except as a nightmare I occasionally remembered. When Vanessa offered redemption, I saw only exposure. Perhaps the silent guest was not conscience, but truth itself. Patient, inexorable, refusing to be murdered along with those who carried it." A visit from the past. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, a young woman in a neat navy coat with serious eyes and carefully mended gloves. She introduced herself as Emily Hargreaves, Vanessa's niece, recently returned from a teaching post overseas. "I felt I had to see the place," she explained over tea, "and the people who knew my aunt during her last days." Emily listened gravely as Miss Marple described Vanessa's composure at the garden fete, her firm yet gentle manner, her attempt to offer Paxton redemption instead of exposure. "My father always said she was stubborn about goodness," Emily said at last. "Not pious, exactly. Just unwilling to give people up as hopeless." "Stubbornness in goodness," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "is as dangerous, in its way, as stubbornness in evil. It exposes one to great risks, but without it, very little in this world would ever be put right." Final reflections. Before Emily left, they visited the churchyard together. Vanessa's grave lay in a quiet corner beneath a simple headstone that read, "She sought peace and found it." Nearby, Geoffrey Sinclair's marker was equally modest. There was no marker for Robert Allen here. His life had ended in a prison cell, his body claimed by distant relatives who buried him under his true name in a city cemetery far away. As they stood there, Emily paused to study the faces of villagers passing along the high street. "It looks so ordinary," she murmured. "You'd never imagine such things had happened here." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, where else would they happen? Cities expect wickedness and are half prepared for it. It is in small, seemingly quiet places that people feel safest. That is where concealment thrives, and where the shock, when it comes, is greatest. But you must not think St. Mary Mead worse than other places. It is only typical. The pattern complete." That evening, alone by her fireside, Miss Marple took down Vanessa's unfinished watercolor of the vicarage garden and studied it thoughtfully. The brushwork grew tentative near the edges, where the painter had left details suggested rather than defined. It struck her that human lives resembled that unfinished border, shaped by intention, interrupted by accident, never entirely complete. The case had demonstrated both the worst and best of human nature: calculated murder alongside genuine compassion, cruel deception balanced by persistent courage. Gerald Paxton had shown how thoroughly one could deceive others while remaining unable to deceive oneself, choosing murder over the redemption Vanessa offered because her compassion demanded he acknowledge his humanity. Outside, the church clock struck 9, its measured notes carrying clearly through the still air. St. Mary Mead, having survived its brush with old scandals and new crimes, settled a little deeper into itself, wiser now, if not in ways it would openly admit. Miss Marple replaced the painting above the mantel and returned to her knitting. The mystery was closed, the pattern complete. The silent guest who had never left, that persistent presence of truth and conscience, had finally departed, leaving behind lessons about the terrible cost of living a lie and the redemptive power of facing truth, however late that facing might come. Murder, she reflected, was ultimately about understanding what people were willing to sacrifice to protect their carefully constructed lives. And the solution to murder required understanding that truth, like conscience, could be delayed but never permanently silenced. Tomorrow there would be small concerns again. A neighbor's rheumatism, a dispute about allotment boundaries, the eternal question of whether the grocer's new assistant was entirely trustworthy. Life would go on, as it must. But somewhere beneath those trivialities ran the steady current of what had been learned, that no facade, however carefully constructed, could forever keep reality at bay. And when, as surely as the seasons turned, another disturbance broke the surface of village life, Miss Marple would be waiting, quietly attentive, her eyes as sharp and her understanding of the human heart as unillusioned as ever.